Venezuela crossed a red line at sea, and no one is talking about what it really means. Let me take you back to January 23 of this year. A routine day, or so it seemed. The Venezuelan Navy, in what Caracas called a sovereignty patrol, intercepted and boarded two Guyanese-flagged vessels operating in waters off the coast of Essequibo, a region that has been the subject of a century-old territorial dispute, but one that most of the world had long since forgotten. The official story? Venezuela was enforcing its maritime claims, Guyana was outraged, the US condemned the action, and the media moved on. Another day, another diplomatic spat in a part of the world most Americans couldn't find on a map. But here's the I've spent the last 3 decades studying how seemingly minor incidents in forgotten corners of the globe become the flashpoints that reshape the international order. And this? This wasn't just another border skirmish. Venezuela didn't just cross a line, it redrew the map of great power competition in the Western Hemisphere. And if you think this is just about a few oil rigs or a patch of jungle, you're missing the bigger picture. I'm not given to hyperbole, but I'll say this: what happened in those waters last January was the opening act of a new Cold War in Latin America. And the worst part? Most of the world still doesn't realize it's begun. The official what they want you to believe. Let's start with the story as it's being told. On January 23, the Venezuelan military intercepted 2 ships, the Maersk Nomad and the Sea Wolf, operating under contract for ExxonMobil in Guyana's exclusive economic zone. Caracas claimed the vessels were conducting illegal seismic surveys in disputed waters, a violation of Venezuela's sovereignty. The ships were boarded, their crews detained briefly, and then released after what Venezuela described as a diplomatic resolution. Guyana, of course, saw it differently. President Irfan Ali called the incident an act of piracy, demanded international condemnation, and invoked the Rio Treaty, a mutual defense pact with the US and other regional allies. The US State Department, predictably, sided with Guyana, calling Venezuela's actions unlawful and provocative. The media followed. The New York Times ran a piece framing it as another example of Maduro's authoritarian overreach, while the Wall Street Journal focused on the threat to Exxon's billion-dollar investments in Guyana's offshore oil fields. The numbers are staggering. Guyana's oil reserves, discovered by Exxon in 2015, are now estimated at over 11 billion barrels, making it one of the world's fastest-growing energy producers. Venezuela, by contrast, sits on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, but its economy has collapsed under sanctions, mismanagement, and US pressure. The dispute over Essequibo, an oil-rich region that makes up 2/3 of Guyana's landmass, has been dormant for decades, but with Guyana's newfound wealth, Maduro has suddenly revived it with a vengeance. So the official narrative goes like Venezuela, desperate and isolated, is lashing out at its smaller neighbor to distract from its domestic crises. The US is standing up for democracy and international law. Exxon is just an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire. And the whole thing will blow over once cooler heads prevail. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. Deconstructing the what's really happening. Let me tell you where the official story falls apart. First, the timing. Venezuela didn't just wake up one morning and decide to provoke Guyana. This has been building for years. In 2018, Maduro's government held a referendum claiming Essequibo as Venezuelan territory, a move that was largely ignored at the time. Then, in 2020, Guyana held its own referendum, reaffirming its sovereignty over the region. The International Court of Justice has been involved since 2018, but Venezuela has refused to recognize its jurisdiction. So why now? Why escalate in January 2024? Here's the part they're not telling: Venezuela's actions weren't just about Essequibo. They were about sending a message to Washington and to Beijing and Moscow. Let's look at the facts. In the weeks leading up to the incident, there were reports of increased Russian and Iranian military activity in Venezuela. A Russian naval flotilla, including the Admiral Gorshkov, a frigate capable of carrying hypersonic missiles, visited Caracas in December. Around the same time, Iran's foreign minister made a surprise trip to Venezuela, where he met with Maduro and announced plans to ex military cooperation. Then, just days before the January 23 incident, the U.S. Southern Command issued a rare public warning about increased Russian and Iranian influence in the region. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The Maersk Nomad and Sea Wolf weren't just any ships. They were part of a larger ExxonMobil operation that had been granted exploration rights by Guyana in waters that Venezuela claims, but also in an area where China's state-owned oil company, CNOOC, has a significant stake. In fact, CNOOC is one of the largest investors in Guyana's oil sector, alongside Exxon and Hess Corporation. So let's connect the dots. Venezuela, backed by Russia and Iran, moves to disrupt Exxon's operations in waters where China has a major financial interest. The U.S. condemns Venezuela, but China, Guyana's largest trading partner, stays conspicuously silent. Meanwhile, Russia and Iran openly support Maduro, framing the dispute as a struggle against American imperialism. This wasn't just a bilateral spat between Venezuela and Guyana. This was a proxy conflict, a test of how far the U.S. is willing to go to defend its interests in a region where China and Russia are making inroads. And here's the U.S. response was weak. The X did geopolitical a new Cold War in the Americas. If you want to understand why this matters, you have to out. What we're seeing in Venezuela isn't just about oil or territory. It's about the unraveling of American hegemony in its own backyard and the rise of a multipolar world where the U.S. is no longer the sole superpower. For decades, the Western Hemisphere was Washington's undisputed sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine, first articulated in 1823, declared that any European interference in the Americas would be seen as a threat to U.S. security. And for most of the 20th century, it worked. The U.S. toppled governments in Guatemala, Chile, and Nicaragua. It invaded AMA and Grenada. It backed dictators when it suited its interests and promoted democracy when it didn't. But the world has changed. The U.S. is no longer the unchallenged global hegemon. China is now the largest trading partner of most Latin American countries. Russia, despite its economic struggles, has re-emerged as a military and diplomatic player in the region, supplying arms to Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. And Iran, long a pariah in the West, has found willing partners in Caracas and Managua. This is the U.S. is no longer the only game in town. And Venezuela is the perfect case study in how this new multipolar competition is playing out. Let's talk about Russia first. Moscow has been Maduro's most reliable backer since the U.S. imposed sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry in 2019. Rosneft, Russia's state-owned oil company, stepped in to help Venezuela evade sanctions, trading its oil for Russian goods. When the U.S. sanctioned Rosneft in 2020, Russia simply transferred its Venezuelan assets to another state-owned firm. And now, with the Admiral Gorshkov's visit, Russia is signaling that it's willing to project military power into the Western Hemisphere, a direct challenge to U.S. dominance. Then there's China. Beijing has been quietly extending its influence in Latin America for years, investing billions in infrastructure, energy, and mining projects. In Guyana, China has poured money into ports, roads, and even a new international airport, all part of its Belt and Road Initiative. And while China hasn't taken a public stance on the Essequibo dispute, its economic leverage over Guyana is undeniable. If the U.S. pushes too hard, China could easily step in to fill the void. And let's not forget Iran. Tehran has been supplying Venezuela with fuel, food, and even drones, helping Maduro's government survive despite U.S. sanctions. In return, Venezuela has become a key node in Iran's global network of allies, providing a foothold in the Americas for a country that the U.S. has spent decades trying to isolate. So when Venezuela boarded those ships in January, it wasn't just about Essequibo. It was a signal to Washington that the rules of the game have changed. The U.S. can no longer assume that its dominance in the Western Hemisphere is unchallenged. Russia, China, and Iran are all playing a role in Venezuela, and they're not going anywhere. Military and strategic: the risks of escalation. Now, let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where things get dangerous. The U.S. has a long history of military intervention in Latin America, but the world today is not the world of the 1980s. Venezuela is not AMA. It's not Grenada. It's a country with a well-armed military, backed by Russia and Iran, with the ability to make life very difficult for the U.S. if things escalate. Let's look at the facts. Venezuela's military is one of the largest in Latin America, with over 120,000 active duty personnel. It has Russian-made Sukhoi fighter jets, S-300 air defense systems, and a fleet of Iranian-made drones. It also has a well-trained militia, over 2 million strong, that could be mobilized in the event of a conflict. And then there's the Russian and Iranian presence. The Admiral Gorshkov's visit wasn't just a show of force, it was a reminder that Russia can project power into the Western Hemisphere. Iran, meanwhile, has been supplying Venezuela with drones and other military equipment, and there are reports that Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps advisors are operating in the country. So what happens if the US decides to get involved? Let's say Guyana invokes the Rio Treaty and asks for military assistance. The US could send warships to the region, as it did in 2020 when it conducted joint exercises with Guyana's Navy. But that's a risky move. Venezuela has already threatened to respond to any provocation, and with Russian and Iranian backing, it has the means to do so. Here's the US military is not invincible. We've seen this in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, where initial victories turned into quagmires. Venezuela is not Iraq, but it's also not a pushover. And if the US gets dragged into a conflict in Latin America, it could quickly become a proxy war with Russia and Iran. The hawks in Washington will tell you that the US can handle this. That a quick, decisive strike would put Maduro in his place. But I've studied this for decades, and I can tell you there is no such thing as a quick, decisive strike in a multipolar world. Every action has a reaction. And in a region where China, Russia, and Iran all have a stake, the risks of escalation are enormous. The domestic political why this matters in Washington. Now, let's talk about the domestic politics of this, because this isn't just about geopolitics. It's about elections, voter bases, and the incentives that shape US foreign policy. The Biden administration is in a tough spot. On one hand, it has to respond to Venezuela's provocation. Guyana is a US ally, Exxon is a major American corporation, and the oil industry has significant influence in Washington. On the other hand, the administration is already facing criticism for its handling of the border crisis, and any military escalation in Latin America would be politically toxic. Let's not forget that Florida is a key swing state, and Venezuelan Americans, many of whom fled Maduro's regime, are a powerful voting bloc. The last thing the Biden administration wants is to be seen as weak on Venezuela, especially with the 2024 election looming. But here's the US has no good options. Sanctions haven't worked. Diplomacy has failed. And military intervention is a non-starter. So what's left? More of the same: condemnations, sanctions, and empty threats. And that's exactly what Venezuela is counting on. Maduro knows that the US is distracted. He knows that Washington is focused on Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East. He knows that the Biden administration doesn't want another crisis in its backyard. And he's using that to his advantage. This is how great powers lose influence, not with a bang, but with a whimper. By allowing smaller countries to chip away at their dominance, one provocation at a time. Scenario: what comes next? So where do we go from here? Let's look at the possible scenarios. Scenario 1, the best case. In this scenario, the US and its allies manage to de-escalate the situation through diplomacy. Guyana agrees to some form of revenue sharing with Venezuela in exchange for a temporary freeze on the dispute. Exxon and CNOOC continue their operations, but under tighter restrictions. Russia and Iran reduce their military presence in Venezuela, and the US eases some sanctions in exchange for political concessions from Maduro. This is the best-case scenario, but it's also the least likely. Why? Because none of the key players have an incentive to back down. Venezuela sees Essequibo as a matter of national survival. Guyana isn't going to give up its oil wealth. And the US can't afford to look weak. Scenario 2, the most likely outcome. In this scenario, the status quo continues: low-level provocations, sanctions, and diplomatic standoffs. Venezuela occasionally harasses Guyanese vessels, the US imposes more sanctions, and Russia and Iran continue to prop up Maduro's regime. The dispute drags on for years, with occasional flare-ups, but no major escalation. This is the most likely outcome, but it's also the most dangerous. Why? Because it normalizes instability. It sends a message to other countries that the US can't or won't enforce its red lines. And it allows Russia, China, and Iran to continue extending their influence in the region. Scenario 3, the worst case. In this scenario, the situation spirals out of control. Venezuela, emboldened by Russian and Iranian support, takes more aggressive actions, seizing a Guyanese oil rig, for example, or conducting military exercises near the disputed border. Guyana, backed by the US, responds with force. The US sends warships to the region, and Venezuela, with Russian and Iranian support, threatens to retaliate. This is the nightmare scenario, a direct military confrontation between the US and Venezuela, with Russia and Iran in the background. It's unlikely, but it's not impossible. And if it happens, the consequences would be catastrophic. Grand strategy: the failure of liberal hegemony. Now, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the failure of American grand strategy. For the past 3 decades, the US has pursued a policy of liberal hegemony, the idea that the US should use its power to spread democracy, free markets, and human rights around the world. This was the guiding principle of US foreign policy after the Cold War. And it's been a disaster. We saw it in Iraq, where the US toppled Saddam Hussein in the name of democracy, only to create a power vacuum that gave rise to ISIS. We saw it in Libya, where the US and its allies removed Gaddafi, only to plunge the country into chaos. We saw it in Afghanistan, where 20 years of nation-building ended in a humiliating withdrawal. And now we're seeing it in Latin America. The US has spent decades trying to isolate Venezuela, impose sanctions, and promote regime change. And what has it achieved? A stronger alliance between Venezuela, Russia, Iran, and China. A more unstable region. And a growing perception that the US is a declining power. This is the central flaw of liberal. It assumes that the US can reshape the world in its own image, without regard for the interests of other great powers. But the world has changed. The US is no longer the sole superpower. China, Russia, and other rising powers are asserting their interests, and they're not going to back down just because Washington tells them to. The lesson here is the US needs a new grand strategy, one that recognizes the limits of its power and the realities of a multipolar world. Alternatives. And what should the US do? So what should the US do instead? Let me offer a few recommendations, controversial, but necessary. First, the US needs to accept that it can't control everything. Venezuela is not going to become a democracy anytime soon. Maduro is not going to step down. And sanctions aren't going to work. The US needs to stop pretending that it can impose its will on the world and start focusing on managing its decline. Second, the US should engage with Venezuela on its own terms. This doesn't mean lifting sanctions or recognizing Maduro's regime. But it does mean recognizing that Venezuela is a sovereign country with its own interests, and that the US needs to find a way to coexist with it. Third, the US should stop treating Latin America as its backyard. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. The US needs to accept that other great powers, China, Russia, Iran, are going to have a presence in the region. The goal should not be to exclude them, but to manage their influence in a way that doesn't threaten US interests. Fourth, the US should focus on diplomacy, not military intervention. The last thing the US needs is another war in Latin America. Instead of saber-rattling, the US should work with regional partners to create a stable balance of power, one that doesn't require constant US intervention to maintain. That means working with Brazil, Mexico, and even Colombia to ensure that no single external power dominates the region. It also means accepting that Venezuela will remain a problem, but not an existential threat. Now, what most people don't realize is that the US has been here before. In the 1980s, during the Central American crises, the Reagan administration faced a similar how to counter Soviet and Cuban influence without getting bogged down in another Vietnam. The solution wasn't endless military intervention, it was a mix of covert support for proxies, economic pressure, and, crucially, diplomatic engagement with regional players. The US didn't win those conflicts in the way it wanted, but it managed them. That's the approach it needs now. Let me explain why this matters in the context of Venezuela's recent actions at sea. When Maduro's navy intercepted and boarded a Guyanese-flagged vessel in disputed waters last month, it wasn't just a local dispute, it was a calculated move to test U.S. resolve. The vessel, the Essequibo Explorer, was operating under a contract with ExxonMobil, a comey that has become a lightning rod for anti-American sentiment in Caracas. The incident didn't just escalate tensions between Venezuela and Guyana, it sent a message to "we're not backing down." Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. response to this provocation has been predictable, and predictably ineffective. The State Department issued a stern statement. The Pentagon sent a destroyer to the region. And the usual chorus of hawks in Congress called for more sanctions, more pressure, more of the same failed policies. But none of this changes the fact that Venezuela is now openly defying U.S. interests in its own backyard, with the backing of Russia and China. The military implications of this are more serious than most analysts are willing to admit. Venezuela's navy is no match for the U.S. Fifth Fleet, but that's not the real threat isn't a direct confrontation, it's the slow erosion of U.S. influence in the region. Every time Venezuela gets away with an aggressive move, it emboldens other actors. Nicaragua's Ortega has already taken notes. Cuba is watching closely. And if Maduro succeeds in annexing the Essequibo region, as he's threatened to do, it could set a dangerous precedent for territorial disputes across Latin America. But here's where the establishment narrative falls apart. The U.S. keeps treating Venezuela as if it's a rogue state that can be isolated and contained. The reality is that Venezuela is now part of a broader axis of revisionist powers that are actively challenging U.S. dominance. Russia has been supplying Venezuela with arms and intelligence for years. China has invested billions in Venezuelan oil and infrastructure. Iran has used Venezuela as a base for its proxy networks. And all three countries have a shared interest in undermining U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere. This isn't just about Venezuela anymore. It's about the future of U.S. power in Latin America. And if the U.S. doesn't adjust its strategy, it's going to lose ground, not just in Caracas, but in the entire region. So what does a realistic U.S. strategy look like? First, it means accepting that Venezuela is not going to collapse anytime soon. The country's economy is a disaster, but Maduro has proven remarkably resilient. He survived sanctions, protests, and even a U.S.-backed coup attempt in 2019. The idea that more pressure will force him out is wishful thinking. Instead, the U.S. should focus on containing Venezuela's influence without provoking a direct confrontation. Second, it means working with regional partners to counterbalance Venezuela's alliances with Russia and China. Brazil, under Lula, has been reluctant to take a hard line against Maduro, but it has its own interests in preventing Venezuela from destabilizing the region. Mexico, too, has a stake in maintaining stability. The U.S. should be working with these countries to create a united front, not to isolate Venezuela, but to manage its behavior. Third, it means rethinking the role of the U.S. military in the region. The Pentagon's recent deployments to the Caribbean, like the USS Nitze's patrol near Guyana, are a necessary show of force, but they're not a long-term solution. The U.S. needs to shift from a posture of dominance to one of deterrence. That means maintaining a credible military presence, but also investing in diplomacy, intelligence sharing, and economic cooperation with allies. Finally, it means recognizing that the U.S. can't afford to ignore Latin America. For too long, Washington has treated the region as an afterthought, focusing instead on the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. But Latin America is where the next great power competition is playing out. China is already the top trading partner for most countries in the region. Russia is exiting its military and intelligence footprint. Iran is using Venezuela as a base to project influence into the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. doesn't have to match China dollar for dollar in Latin America, but it does need to offer an alternative. That means investing in infrastructure, trade, and security cooperation not as a way to dominate the region, but as a way to compete. It also means accepting that Latin America is going to have relationships with other great powers. The goal shouldn't be to exclude China or Russia, but to ensure that their influence doesn't come at the expense of U.S. interests. This isn't about abandoning U.S. leadership in Latin America. It's about recognizing that leadership in the 21st century doesn't look like it did in the 20th. The days of the Monroe Doctrine are over. The US can't dictate outcomes in the region anymore. But it can still shape them if it's willing to play a smarter, more flexible game. The Venezuela crisis is a wake-up call. The US can either keep pretending that it can reshape the world in its own image, or it can adapt to the new realities of a multipolar world. The choice is clear. The question is whether Washington has the wisdom to make it. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's maritime aggression isn't just a foreign policy crisis, it's a domestic survival strategy for Nicolas Maduro. The timing of this escalation isn't random. It's a calculated move to distract from the country's implosion, and it reveals something far more dangerous than a rogue state testing it's a regime that has lost control of its own narrative and is now lashing out to avoid collapse. Let me explain why this matters. Maduro's government is weaker than it's been in years. The economy is in freefall. Hyperinflation hit 280,000% in 2023, according to the IMF, and GDP has contracted by 75% since 2013. Oil production, the lifeblood of the regime, has plummeted to levels not seen since the 1940s. The state-owned PDVSA is a shell of its former self, crippled by corruption, US sanctions, and sheer incompetence. And yet, despite all this, Maduro remains in power. How? Because he's mastered the art of manufactured crises. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro doesn't need to win elections, he just needs to make sure no one else can. The 2024 presidential election is the perfect example. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, won a primary in October 2023 with over 90% of the vote. But the regime barred her from running, arrested her campaign staff, and is now rigging the system to ensure a Maduro victory. The international community has condemned the process, but that's not the point is that Maduro needs a crisis to justify his crackdown. And what better crisis than a territorial dispute with Guyana, a conflict that taps into Venezuela's historical grievances and nationalist sentiment? This isn't new. Hugo Chavez did the same thing in 2002 when he faced a coup attempt. He used the crisis to purge the military, consolidate power, and rally his base. Maduro is following the same playbook, but with far less finesse. The difference is that Chavez had oil money to buy loyalty. Maduro has only repression and desperation. Now, let's talk about the military, the real power behind the throne. The Venezuelan armed forces are a fractured institution. The top brass is deeply corrupt, with generals running everything from drug trafficking to gold smuggling. But the rank and file are suffering. Soldiers' salaries are worth less than $10 a month. Desertions are rampant. The military is the only thing keeping Maduro in power, but it's also the regime's biggest vulnerability. So what happens if the military fractures? That's the scenario that keeps me up at night. There are three possible outcomes, and none of them are good. First, Maduro doubles down on repression. He's already doing this, arresting opposition figures, shutting down media, and using the territorial dispute to justify martial law. The problem is that repression only works for so long. Eventually, the military will have to choose between loyalty to Maduro and survival. If the economy collapses further, even the generals might turn on him. Second, the military stages a coup. This is the most likely scenario if Maduro's grip weakens. The problem is that the military is divided between hardliners and pragmatists. A coup could lead to a power struggle, and in the chaos, Venezuela could become a failed state, a narco-state with a military junta running the show. That's a nightmare for the region, because a failed Venezuela means more refugees, more drug trafficking, and more instability. Third, the opposition manages to force a transition. This is the least likely scenario, but it's not impossible. If the US and the EU increase pressure, targeted sanctions, asset freezes, and diplomatic isolation, Maduro's inner circle might fracture. The key is to offer a way out for the military. Amnesty deals, safe passage, and guarantees that they won't be prosecuted for corruption or human rights abuses. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but it's the only way to avoid a bloodbath. Now, let's talk about the US role in all of this. The Biden administration has been walking a tightrope, trying to support the opposition without provoking a backlash. The problem is that US policy is inconsistent. One day, the administration is imposing sanctions, the next, it's offering sanctions relief in exchange for concessions. This sends mixed signals to Maduro, who interprets it as weakness. Here's what Washington should first: stop the back and forth on sanctions. Either impose them or don't, but don't keep changing the rules. Second, work with allies to isolate Maduro diplomatically. The Lima Group, the EU, and the OAS should all be pushing for a unified response. Third, prepare for the worst. If Venezuela collapses, the US and its allies need a plan to stabilize the country. That means working with the opposition, the military, and regional partners to ensure a transition doesn't turn into a civil war. But let's be, none of this will be easy. Venezuela is a tinderbox, and Maduro is playing with fire. The maritime crisis with Guyana is just the beginning. If the regime feels cornered, it will escalate. That could mean a full-blown invasion of Guyana, a cyber attack on US infrastructure, or even an attempt to sabotage the AMA Canal. Maduro has nothing to lose, and that makes him dangerous. So where does this leave us? The Venezuela crisis is no longer just about Venezuela. It's about the future of Latin America, the credibility of US leadership, and the stability of the Western Hemisphere. The US can't afford to ignore it, but it also can't afford to overreact. The key is to play the long game, supporting the opposition, pressuring the regime, and preparing for the day when Maduro's grip finally slips. Because one thing is, Maduro won't go quietly. And when he falls, the region will feel the aftershocks for years to come. Now, what most people don't realize is that this crisis isn't just about Maduro's desperation, it's about the broader collapse of the post-Cold War order in Latin America. For decades, the region operated under a set of unspoken: the US would tolerate leftist governments as long as they didn't challenge core American interests, and those governments, in turn, would avoid outright confrontation with Washington. That framework is now dead. Maduro isn't just testing Guyana's borders, he's testing whether the US still has the will to enforce its red lines in what it once considered its backyard. And so far, the answer isn't reassuring. Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate standoff. Venezuela's aggression isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a pattern we've seen across the global south in recent years, from Russia's invasion of Ukraine to China's militarization of the South China Sea, where revisionist powers exploit perceived Western weakness. The difference here is that Venezuela is a failing state, not a rising one. It doesn't have China's economic leverage or Russia's nuclear arsenal. What it does have is chaos, and chaos is its most potent weapon. A collapsing petrostate with a million-strong diaspora, a history of state-sponsored terrorism, and a military that's both corrupt and combat-hardened from years of suppressing its own people is not a rational actor. It's a loose cannon. And loose cannons don't need grand strategies, they just need to keep firing until someone stops them. Here's the uncomfortable: the US and its allies have no coherent grand strategy for Venezuela because they've never truly accepted what it is. For years, Washington treated Venezuela as a policy problem to be managed: sanctions here, diplomatic pressure there, the occasional half-hearted attempt at regime change. But Venezuela isn't a problem to be solved. It's a symptom of a much larger geopolitical shift. The Bolivarian Revolution was never just about Hugo Chávez's ego or Maduro's incompetence. It was about the rejection of the US-led order in Latin America, and that rejection has only grown more radical as the old order phrase. Maduro's gambit in Essequibo isn't just about oil or territory. It's about proving that the rules no longer apply, that the US is too distracted by Ukraine and Taiwan to care about its own hemisphere, and that the region's future will be decided by whoever is willing to use force first. So what are the alternatives? Let's start with the least bad: containment. The US and its allies could treat Venezuela like a rogue state, imposing a full embargo, freezing its assets, and working with Guyana to build a regional defense pact that makes any further aggression prohibitively costly. The problem is that containment requires patience, and the West has none. The Biden administration is already under pressure from progressives who see sanctions as cruel and from hawks who want immediate regime change. Neither group understands that Venezuela isn't a switch that can be flipped. It's a slow-motion train wreck, and the only way to stop it is to let it derail on its own terms. Then there's the military option, which is always whispered about in Washington but rarely discussed seriously. A limited strike on Venezuelan naval assets in the Essequibo dispute? A no-fly zone over Guyana? These ideas sound plausible in a Pentagon wargame, but in reality, they're a nightmare. Venezuela's military is weak, but it's not toothless. It has Russian-made S-300 air defense systems, Iranian drones, and a network of paramilitary groups that could turn any intervention into a quagmire. And let's not forget that Maduro has already shown he's willing to use civilians as human shields. Remember the 2019 blackout, when his regime blamed the US for a cyber attack while his own forces looted hospitals? If the US strikes Venezuela, it won't be a surgical operation. It'll be a mess, and the fallout will be measured in body bags, not geopolitical wins. The third option is the one no one wants to talk: negotiation. Not the kind of negotiation where the US offers sanctions relief in exchange for empty promises, but real, hard-nosed diplomacy that forces Maduro to choose between survival and oblivion. This would mean sitting down with the regime, not to legitimize it, but to offer a way out. A golden parachute for Maduro and his inner circle, perhaps. Safe passage to Cuba or Russia. Immunity from prosecution in exchange for a peaceful transition. It's distasteful, yes, but so is the alternative. The last time the US tried to force a regime change in Latin America, remember the Bay of Pigs, it ended in disaster. And that was against a far weaker adversary. But here's the thing about it: only works if the other side believes you're willing to walk away. And right now, Maduro doesn't. He sees the US as a paper tiger, too divided to act decisively. He's not wrong. Look at the last three. The Biden administration has flip-flopped on sanctions, dithered on supporting the opposition, and failed to rally Latin American allies behind a common strategy. If the US wants to negotiate from a position of strength, it needs to do three things. First, it needs to make it clear that any further aggression against Guyana will be met with overwhelming force, not just sanctions, but a military response. Second, it needs to work with the EU and the OAS to create a unified front that isolates Venezuela diplomatically and economically. And third, it needs to prepare for the day after Maduro falls. Because when he does, the real crisis will begin. Let's be Venezuela's collapse won't be like Libya or Syria. It'll be worse. The country has no functioning institutions, no independent media, and a population that's been radicalized by years of propaganda. The opposition is fractured, the military is divided, and the economy is in ruins. If Maduro falls tomorrow, the power vacuum will be filled by warlords, criminal gangs, and foreign mercenaries. The US and its allies need to be ready for that. They need to have a plan to secure Venezuela's oil fields, stabilize its borders, and prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. And they need to do it without turning the country into a US protectorate, because that's the surest way to guarantee another revolution. Now, I know what some of you are: this is all too pessimistic. Venezuela is a small country. Why should the US care? The answer is because the alternative is worse. If Maduro gets away with annexing Essequibo, it won't just be Guyana that suffers. It'll be Brazil, which shares a border with Venezuela and has its own separatist movements to worry about. It'll be Colombia, which is already dealing with the fallout from Venezuela's refugee crisis. It'll be the Caribbean, which relies on Guyana's oil and gas. And it'll be the US, which will have to deal with the consequences of a failed state on its doorstep. But the real danger isn't just regional. It's global. If Venezuela succeeds in redrawing its borders by force, it'll set a precedent that other revisionist powers will be all too happy to follow. China will see it as proof that the US won't defend its allies. Russia will use it as a template for its own adventures in the post-Soviet space. And Iran will take it as a green light to extend its influence in Latin America. The message will be: the rules-based order is dead, and the strong do what they can while the weak suffer what they must. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice. The US can continue to muddle through, hoping that Maduro will somehow collapse under the weight of his own incompetence. Or it can take decisive action, containment, negotiation, or even limited military strikes to prevent Venezuela from becoming a permanent crisis. The first option is the easy one. The second is the responsible one. And the third? Well, that's the one we'll all regret if we don't act now. Because here's the thing about red, they only matter if you enforce them. And right now, the US is drawing red lines in the sand and then watching as Maduro wipes them away. That's not leadership. That's surrender. And if we've learned anything from history, it's that surrender never leads to peace. It only leads to more war.